Good morning, all of you, my dear friends. Let us start today class with the first topic, law of transmissibility of forces. Then we will study law of superposition and then resultant force, my dear friends. So today, now I am live on my YouTube channel, IITIAN Mechanical Wala, which welcomes you all. So let us start, my dear friend, with law of transmission with principle. 1 minute, just 1 minute. With principle of principle of transmissibility of force of a force, very important, my dear friends. So as per principle of transmissibility of force, we can transfer a force along the same line of action from one point to another point. This is the principle of transmissibility of force, my dear friends. हम इसमें जो फोर्स होता है जिस उसकी लाइन ऑफ एक्शन पर एक पॉइंट से दूसरे पॉइंट के ऊपर हम ट्रांसमिट कर सकते हैं, फोर्स को ट्रांसफर कर सकते हैं, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. सो ए फोर्स कैन बी transferred from one point of its application to another point along its line of action. My dear friends, this is very important, my dear friends, along its line of action. This is very important, my dear friends, along its line of action from one point to another point, my dear friends. From one point to another point can be transferred. So this is nothing. This is about principle of transmissibility of force. For example, my dear friends, let us suppose there is a body. Let me take it somewhere. Okay, my dear friends. So let us suppose this is a body, my dear friends, and a force is acting. Let me take. Let me take 1 minute, just 1 minute, my dear friends. This is a body, and then let me take its line of action, something like that, my dear friends. Okay. And so let us take a force. Let us suppose that force is acting at this point, a point. A force is acting, my dear friends. Let me take that force with this color, my dear friends. Okay. So let us suppose there is a force acting along this. Okay. And this is nothing but this is, let us suppose this is F. So now what we can do, we can transfer this force which is acting at point A on its line of action somewhere else. Okay, so let us take another point that is the B point. Okay, my dear friends, over there. Be careful. So what we can do, we can transmit this force from A point to B point, my dear friends, and this is line of action of force O. Okay, along this, very important. So be careful. So let me take another force over there, and that is that, my dear friends. Okay, this force, something like that. Okay, and this is nothing. This is what, same force, my dear friends. So from this point to this point along its line of action, we can transfer it. Okay. So be careful. So this is about principle of transmissibility force, my dear friends. Okay. So you can take like that. That's not a problem. But very important, my dear friends. Either you have to show only this which is given to you initially, or then don't take this part. Just show this part, my dear friends. After application of this law of transmissibility force. Okay. Be careful. Now I am just explaining you. Okay. But you need to be very careful. Problem is this, my dear friends. Use this, okay, and give answer. So what you need to do then, after statement of this or after application of this principle of transmissibility of force, my dear friends, your answer becomes like this, my dear friends. So be careful. Then don't you need not to show this part. Okay, be careful, my dear friends. You need to show line of action, this force, but just sorry, my dear friends. Line of action is okay, but direction of force should be remain same, my dear friends. Sorry for that. In hurry, I so this like so, okay. Sorry for that. So this is not like that, my dear friends. Be careful. This force you need to show direction of force must be in same direction along its line of action. Very important, my dear friends. Be careful. Be careful, my dear friends. So this was problem given to you, my dear friends. Okay. So according to this, then this problem becomes like this, my dear friends. Be careful, okay? Like this. So now let us move to next example. Very important, my dear friends. I know you have got about all this. Now I'm taking another examples. So let us put this is a member on which two force F1, F2 on its ends are acting in opposite directions. So let me take two force over there acting one force at this point and another force is acting over there, my dear friends, this point. Okay, and one force is F1 and this is F2, my dear friends. Okay, be careful. Now we can change point of application of these two force by keeping direction of both force F1 and F2 in same direction. Very important along the line of action of that particular force, my dear friends. Okay, be careful. So now let me take line of action first. That's very important, my dear friends, of this force. Okay. So line of action of this force, my dear friends. Just 1 minute. Let me take line of action of this force. Let me take this line of action of this force. It's something like that, my dear friends. Be careful. Okay, something like that. And let me take line of action of this force F2, my dear friends. That's also very important, my dear friends. Be careful. Line of action of this force F2. That is also very, very important, my dear friends. Something like that. Okay. So now F1 and F2, there are two force acting, my dear friends. So according to this, now what we can do? So very easy, my dear friends. So let me take this one. That's very important, my dear friends. So which color? Okay, that's not the problem. So let me take this now here. Okay, it is something like that. Okay, so this thing I am taking over there. So be careful, my dear friends. So now these two force we can transfer along its line of action. So now I'm transferring this force F1 from there to this side. That's not the problem. Let me take from these points. So let us put this point is A point, my dear friends, over there. This point is B point, my dear friend. Okay, be careful. And this point is C point, my dear friends. And this point is D point. Okay, my dear friends. So B and D are along the line of action of force F2, my dear friends. A and C point are along the line of action of force F1. Be careful, okay? Now we need to take two lines first, line of action. So let me take two lines over there first. Very, very important, my dear friends. And let me take then different line of action for force F2, my dear friends. Just 1 minute. Let me take so this also. Let me take okay. What is going on? 1 minute, my dear friends. I need to take this. This my dear friends. Okay. Be careful, lightweight. Okay. And let me write points over there, my dear friends. So this is A point, this is B point, or this is C point, this is D point. So now what I am going to do, I am now going to transfer force F1 from A point to point C along its line of action, my dear friends. Now force F1. Now I am going to transfer force F1. Be careful, my dear friends. At this point, C point, my dear friends, over there. Be careful, okay? So that is the thing, that is what this force, and then force F2, my dear friends, on B point. Okay, be careful. Now I'm going to transfer force F2 on B point. So be careful. This is force F2 and this is force F1, my dear friends. Be careful. So now direction of force F1 is same, my dear friends. Like this, direction of force F2 is like that, and that is also same, my dear friends, along its line of action. So we can, by application of this law of transmissibility force or principle of transmissibility force, so these problems you can also uh, write like this. Okay. So now let us move to next topic, my dear friends. Law of superposition. Law of superposition. So in this, what this law states that. So in this very important, my dear friends, 1 minute. Law of superposition. In this, इसके अंदर हम कुछ फोर्स लेते हैं, किसी सिस्टम की वजह से वो फोर्स लेते हैं, और फिर हम क्या करते हैं, दूसरा कोई सिस्टम फोर्स लेते हैं, उसके कुछ फोर्स लेते हैं, उन फोर्स को हम सब्ट्रैक्ट या ऐड कर सकते हैं, लेकिन पहले वाला जो सिस्टम है वो इक्विलिब्रियम में रहेगा। फोर्सेस का जो सिस्टम है, जो फोर्सेस जब इक्विलिब्रियम में होते हैं, वो जो सेकंड हम लगाएंगे उसके बाद भी वो जो सिस्टम फोर्सेस है वो इक्विलिब्रियम में रहेगा। वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स। तो लॉ ऑफ सुपरपोजिशन प्रिंसिपल, देयर इज नो if a body if a body is in equilibrium, my dear friends, if a body is in equilibrium or rigid body we can take, my dear friends, or is in motion, my dear friends, then we can add or subtract. Then as per this law, then forces of a system in equilibrium can be added or subtracted from another system of forces. Be careful, my dear friends. Keeping that body, keeping that rigid body in equilibrium, and it was same equilibrium or in same motion, my dear friends. Be careful. Same equilibrium or same position. So this is a the statement of law of superposition, my dear friends. So with an example. Now you can understand here. Okay, very easy. It is not very typical, my dear friends. So now I am taking one example. So let me dictate this one. Okay. So now let us suppose there is a force acting on this, my dear friends. And let us suppose this is nothing. This is F force, my dear friends. So according to this law of superposition, now what we can do, my dear friends, we can add another forces, my dear friends, but there should be no effect of addition or subtraction of forces of second system on first system forces, my dear friends. Be careful. So now what we are going to do, my dear friends, let me take, my dear friends, this one. Okay, line of action of this force, my dear friends. Or somewhere else you can also take, that's not a problem. Just 1 minute. This is this line of action of this force, my dear friends. That's not a problem. So now what I'm going to do, my dear friends, now I'm going to add two forces, my dear friends. Two forces there. Be careful. Let me take this. Okay. So now this force is acting, suppose, over there, my dear friends. At this point, A point. This is A point. You can take, my dear friends. A point. Okay. There. And now let us take, suppose, another point, B point. Okay. Somewhere else, my dear, you can take B point on the line of action of force F, or somewhere another on body you can also take. Be careful. Okay. So that's not an issue. Okay. That's very important, my dear friends. So now let me take force over there to force, my dear friends. So but you what you need to do now, what you are going to do, problem is this, my dear friends. Problem आपको ये दी गई है, अब आपको इस प्रॉब्लम को एज इट इज ही रखना है. अगर ये बॉडी मोशन में है आफ्टर एप्लीकेशन दिस फोर्स, ये बॉडी मोशन में है, इक्विलिब्रियम में, जिस भी टाइप के इक्विलिब्रियम में उस इक्विलिब्रियम में रहनी चाहिए. स्टैटिक इक्विलिब्रियम में स्टैटिक में रहनी चाहिए. अगर ये डायनामिक इक्विलिब्रियम में है तो डायनामिक इक्विलिब्रियम में रहनी चाहिए, माय डियर फ्रेंड्स. यानी अगर इसकी शुरू में वेलोसिटी जीरो तो जीरो रहनी चाहिए. इसके बाद इसमें हम फोर्स ऐड करेंगे अपनी तरफ से उनके बाद. और ये अगर मोशन में है, अगर 5 मीटर पर सेकंड से जा रही है तो ये 5 मीटर पर सेकंड से जानी चाहिए. इसकी गति में कोई चेंज नहीं होना चाहिए हमारे द्वारा फोर्स ऐड करने के बाद. तो दिस इज नथिंग, दिस इज लॉ ऑफ सुपरपोजिशन ऑफ, okay, my dear friends, forces. So now I am going to add now forces, my dear friends. So I am adding a force F1 there, my dear friends. That's very important. Another force F2 I am adding over there, but before that, now let me take this force over there, my dear friends. Okay, now this is F1 force, this is F2 force, my dear friends. Okay, be careful. But what is condition of this law of superposition? These two forces which you added, these two forces are forces of system, another system of forces, my dear friends. Be careful. Now these forces which you are going to add, my dear friends, must be in equal magnitude. Very important. They must have equal magnitude. This F1 and F2. Very important, my dear friends. What is the condition of this? What is the condition of this? Condition is that F1 must be equal to F2. Very important, my dear friends. In magnitude, very important. And they should act in opposite direction. Very important, mindset. And should act in F1 and F2 should act in must act in opposite direction, my dear friends. In opposite direction. So what is going to happen here, my dear friends? F1 and F2 are equal in magnitude, but acting in opposite direction of this body. So nothing will happen, my dear friends, because both are in equal magnitude, both cancels each other. F1 and F2 cancel each other, and because of their direction of motion are opposite. So there is no effect of addition or subtraction of F1 and F2, my dear friends, on this body. Okay, very important, my dear friends. Be careful. Then such a body then such a body of, okay, whether it is in any kind of equilibrium, static or dynamic, or it is in motion, it will remain in same type of equilibrium, static or dynamic, or in motion. So this was all about, my dear friends, law of superposition. So thanks everybody, my dear friends, for today class. I tried my best to make you understand each and every concept, whether it is related to principle of transmissibility force or law of superposition. Okay guys, thank you very much for giving your valuable time. So मिलते हैं जल्दी ही, नेक्स्ट क्लास में आऊंगा लाइव आपको इवनिंग में 8 बजे के आसपास. तो तैयार रहिएगा. आप सभी का तहे दिल से धन्यवाद.